This topic is a topic that can go in different directions. I'm going to take it in the direction, though, of talking about the lessons I learned about loss in the last 35 years or so of work in the field of trauma and loss. My specialty, in terms of my secular research area, my clinical area, has been working with populations that have experienced different kinds of chronic stress, be it families of children with cancer, be it in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, or in Israel at the height of the most recent intifada, or most intensively in New York in the years after the 9/11 attacks. And what's interesting is, in my work with people who have gone through various kinds of intense suffering and loss, I've learned from them, they've taught me 3 or 4 core points that we could bring into our everyday lives. Now, many of the people in this audience have gone through your own loss, your own tragedies, your own chronic stresses. It's almost impossible to live life without it. It says at the beginning of one of the classic Musar works that the purpose of life is lamod b'nisyonos. It's to be able to withstand living with the inevitable trials and tribulations of life. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the collected wisdom that I learned from people who have taught me about the following areas. I'm going to start by first talking about naming the monster. The need to talk. The question often comes, are we better off not talking about certain things? Are you better off putting things behind you? Is it better off to just sort of say, okay, I've experienced this tragedy, but I have to move on to the next phase of my life? And I want to share with you first a Jewish thought and then some of my clinical experiences. There's a brilliant Jewish thought in a very cryptic passage in the Torah describing God's footstool. And here's what it says. It describes God's footstool. Who even knows what this means at whatever mystical levels? And it says that it was K'maseh livnas sapphire, sapphire. The footstool was sapphire, and embedded in the sapphire was brick. And our rabbis teach us the brick was a reminder of our suffering in slavery. It was a reminder of suffering, whatever that means. So Rabbi Rucham Levovitz in pre-Holocaust Europe says the following. He asks an obvious question, Ma inyad shibud la'achar hagula, which means, that is so strange, she says. Why? Whatever the meaning is of this brick in the sapphire footstool is, why the need to remember suffering after times are good? Egypt was a long time ago. We were freed a long time ago. Why the need for that? And he answers in his typical brilliant psychological way with his insights, it's that we always have to, even when times are good, embed in our lives the lessons of the brick to live alongside the lessons of the light. I get this question all the time. Family, God forbid, loses a child to some kind of illness, and they subsequently have a number of other children. They ask me, should I tell my children now that they once had a brother or sister? Why have them have that insecurity? I've often worked with people who, let's say, have a child who had cancer at age 2, had active treatment for it, has no memory for it whatsoever. Now the child is totally healthy. And they ask, do I ever tell the child that one time he had cancer or she had cancer? It's an incredibly valid question. Rabbi Levovitz says, and what I want to argue, is that what we're talking about this afternoon is actually a very important issue in life, and that's that life has an ebb and flow. We have good times and we have tough times. That's the nature of life. But when the sapphire and the light comes into our life, we have to integrate into it the lessons of our past. You have to let a child know, yeah, it's true, you once had a serious illness when they're old enough for it, and it's a case-by-case situation. To let them know, okay, because this may have meaning in your life later on, even though you don't remember it. Or you had a younger brother or sister. Or, yes, to remember, I once had a brush with death, and now, thank God, things are good. But what did I learn from that? Because we very quickly go back into the new normal and may forget the lessons of the past. There's a magnificent statement that is brought down in the Medrash Tehillim. It's one of my favorite statements in the Hebrew language in terms of the wisdom of this point. It says that when we're looking on the tough times in our life, we have to remember the following. Ilu nafalti lo kamti. If I never fell down, I never would have gotten up. Ilu yashafti bachoshech lo haya'arli. If I never sat in the darkness, I wouldn't have experienced the light. So it's the brick in our life, the darkness in our life, that often inform the light, that often inform our sense of gratitude, as we heard last night in the presentation by the Rebbitzin. That's the key point I want to make here in terms of that first point. Now, related to it is a little vignette. I have a colleague who I've been privileged to work with for a number of years, who's considered one of the world's leading experts on post-traumatic stress disorder. I think he's been here in South Africa. He's been all over the world, but he's Boston-based. He was at Harvard, now Boston University, a psychiatrist. His name is Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. We were once working on a paper together, and he shows me an fMRI, picture of the brain of one of his patients when he was reliving the worst moment of his life. This was a man who was caught in the stairwell of the World Trade Center on 9/11 and barely got away with his life. Horrifying experience, life-threatening experience. And he actually, as part of trying to understand this person better and trying to understand trauma better, he had him in an fMRI take a picture of what does the brain look like when you're having a flashback to the worst moment of your life. And he showed it to me, and it was amazing. Because you know what your brain looks like when you're having the worst moment of your life? Broca's area is shut down. The language centers of the brain are shut down. You're literally rendered speechless. Our rabbis tell us that when Aaron heard that his 2 sons died suddenly, the word used is vayidom Aharon. Vayidom is an interesting word. It's a Hebrew word for silence, but it's a different kind of silence. The Barbanel asks, why doesn't it say vayishkod Aharon? The usual word for silence is sheket, be quiet. Why vayidom? And he answers, because sheket is for when you know a response in your head, but you choose not to share it. Demimus, as opposed to sheket, is where you literally are rendered speechless. That's what I was looking at. When I looked at it, the first words that I thought was, this is demimut. And then, this is where it gets practical. What Dr. van der Kolk showed me over a period of subsequent months, that as he gave this man words for his pain, as he helped him name the monster, as he lit up Broca's area, the man got better. The man integrated the lesson of the brick into the sapphire, and he improved. It's amazing. I'm not saying it could happen right away. For many of you who may have gone through particularly devastating tragedies in your life, it may take longer, or it may be a lifetime of struggling to have that integration. But ultimately, naming the monster in some way. It doesn't have to be with words necessarily. It could be with meaning or whatever meaning you find. I'm going to get to that in the next point I want to talk about. But that is ultimately the answer. Just really briefly, I wanted to tell you that there's a Jewish concept. Rabbi Charlap, who was a well-known rabbi in Jerusalem in the early 1900s. I work with his grandson, Yeshiva University. In his Haggadah, he wrote in the early 1900s that slavery, kind of slavery that we deal with on Passover, takes away our koach hadibur. It takes away our power of speech. Slaves have no power of speech. They aren't given the freedom and the space to name the monster and to talk about things. He says when we celebrate the Seder on Seder night, what's it called? Magid, because that's our answer to suffering. We sit around as our family. We sit around together around the table and light up Broca's areas of people, light up the language centers. He says Magid, which is what the Seder is about, is our answer to having our freedom taken away from us all those years ago. So that's part one. Part one is we have to integrate the tough things that happen to us, even in good times, because there are tremendous lessons to learn from it. And on top of that, it's often helpful to figure out a way to approach it, either with words or with other ways. And that brings me to part two. Part two, which is, I think, the most important point I want to share with you today, is the variety of coping mechanisms that people have. We all know that men and women, for example, often have different coping mechanisms. About 80% of women, when they go through a tough time, they're often consoled by talking things out. 80% of men aren't necessarily going to be verbal about what happened. They may prefer to go into the problem-solving mode. So the very thing that helps women is often the very thing that makes men actually sick, okay? And the key is, in any family, there's often a variety of coping mechanisms. So I want to share with you a story and then make some recommendations. It's a story that I learned a tremendous amount from. I was invited to go to Israel at the height of the Second Intifada. This was in 2002, I believe. I was going there to do a lot of lecturing to various trauma therapists. They knew much more about the topic than I did, but you can't think clearly for yourself, even when you're an expert. There's a brilliant saying in the Talmud, Ein chovish mater asmo mi beis hasurim. You can't free yourself from your own prison. And these brilliant experts in trauma were inviting me as an outsider to come to just hang out with them and talk and think things out, because they needed somebody who was living in the relative safety of New York. So one afternoon, I was in the Jerusalem Trauma Center giving a talk to a group of 30 or 40 therapists, and a call comes in to the director of the clinic that there was just a bombing at the Hebrew University cafeteria, the Frank Sinatra cafeteria there. If I remember correctly, 9 people were killed. And immediately, we all know how tightly interconnected Israeli society is. The phone starts ringing off the hook. 9 people, that means who knows how many hundreds of connections and psychiatric emergencies that needed to be cared for right away. And immediately, all the therapists I was speaking to cleared out of the room, of course. And after everybody left, Dr. Brahm gets a call from the director of a camp, a summer camp in the middle of Israel. And the word was that one of their counselors, one of their madrichot, had been killed in the bombing. And Dr. Brahm comes out to me, he says, look, I'm out of therapists. Do you mind going there, tell the kids that their beloved counselor was killed, and spend the day with them? The associate director of the center was still there, and the two of us got in her car. We go to the middle of the country. We go into the camp, fully expecting to be in charge. We'd both done these kind of interventions many times before. It's never easy, but it's often helpful. That doesn't happen in Israel. No Israeli is going to certainly let an American tell them what to do. The director of the camp immediately put me in a corner, put my colleague in a corner, and he got up. And what he said next has really changed in many ways the way I view trauma. And in subsequent research, it's been proven to be 100% true. Always listen to a smart Israeli. Here's what he said. He told the kids about the horrible tragedy. He said, I have 5 coping rooms. One room, you could go, he tells these teenagers, go into the room and write letters to the parents of your madricha about what a wonderful woman she was. Another room is a music room. Go and express yourselves musically. They have musical instruments. You could express yourselves that way. Another room was an art room. Express yourselves artistically. Another room was a prayer room. And another room was the talking room. And the kids were told they could go from room to room throughout the day. But what was amazing to me is the kids divided themselves exactly equally between 4 of the 5 rooms. None of them picked one of the rooms. You want to guess which room it was? Almost everybody says talking, but it was actually the prayer room. Nobody picked prayer, which is the title of another talk, Spirituality in Adolescence. It's an area that I've done, I've been doing a lot of research in lately, but that's another fascinating area. But none of the kids chose the prayer room, but a quarter of the kids spent the afternoon with us, and we spoke for hours and hours about other losses they had. And the writing kids wrote, and the music kids did music, and the art kids did art. What happened was, the following week, I go back to New York, and I was very taken by this experience with the 5 coping rooms. And I was giving a talk, if I remember correctly, it was the first anniversary of 9/11. I was asked to give a talk in New York to a community group. And I told them the story of the 5 coping rooms, because I thought it was a very important story. And a woman comes over to me after the talk, and she tells me the following unbelievable story. She said that her father was a Vishnitsa chassid who was in the concentration camps with Elie Wiesel. She says it had been years, probably about 60 years, since her father had seen Elie Wiesel, but Elie Wiesel had given the Nobel laureate who writes about his experiences in the concentration camps, he was giving a lecture in Manhattan the week before I gave this talk. And her father said, I don't know if Professor Wiesel will remember me, but just tell him my name. Maybe he'll remember me. So she waits online after the talk. And she goes over to Elie Wiesel. She says, you know, my father's name is such and such. You may remember him. He says that he shared a bunk with you in the concentration camp. And immediately, Mr. Wiesel, his eyes tear up. And he says, do I remember him? He saved my life. He never told you that anything I've accomplished is because of your father? I'm here because of him. And he says the following unbelievable story. He said there was a day that was beyond endurance, like all days are, I imagine, in a concentration camp, but it was really getting to them. They were being frozen, they were starved, they were being tortured, they'd already lost immediate family members. Who could even imagine what that was like? And a group of Russian prisoners of war got a hold of some rat poison. And they decided that they're going to end their lives. They wait online, each one patiently taking the dose of poison. And Elie Wiesel said, you know, I was a teenager. What do I know? I figured they're going to kill me anyway. And I figured I was going to make that the last day of my life. And I go online behind the Russians. All of us said, every adolescent in that section of the camp went online behind the Russians, fully intending to end our lives that day. Everybody except your father, the chassid. He said, your father retained his faith even in that horrible place. And he goes off to the side of the line, and he breaks in to this ancient Vishnitsa nigun, this ancient Hasidic tomb, for Ani Mamin be'emuna shlema b'vias HaMashiach. I believe with total faith in ultimate redemption. And Professor Wiesel says the song broke our suicidal spell. One by one, we left the line. one by one, we surrounded your father and joined him in singing the Animam. And none of us took our lives that day. And I'm here because of your father. Go home and remind him of what he did for me. That's the power of coping. Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's talking, sometimes it's taking it in instead of words, it's doing chesed, acts of kindness for others. And often it changes. When we work with traumatized children, based on what I learned in that, we will actually show them an upsetting film clip and have them rate how upset they are for about 10 minutes. We then have a table filled with 13 different coping mechanisms. Perfumes, comic books for them to distract themselves. We have aromatherapy and lotion therapies, and you name it. We have music on iPods, and we have the kids go, and they pick what works for them. And over the course of time, they develop their own toolbox of coping mechanisms. This doesn't have to be extreme trauma. It could be the regular stress in your life. What works for you? What works for those who are close to you? And don't get judgmental and think that just because something works for you, it's going to work for your husband, your son, your daughter, your father, your mother, your best friend. It doesn't work that way. You have to accept it. Tell you a story, okay? I know this gets a little heavy, but somewhat lighter story. I think I said this to a group of therapists earlier this week, last week, on Friday. I was at a retreat for families of children with cancer. It was the first one this organization had, High Lifeline had. Everybody was very nervous about whether it would work. And getting up to start the program and to break open what the program was about, which was talking about everybody having in common a seriously ill child. And I was standing at a lectern like this, and I'm about to start the talk. This was about 20 years ago. And before I could open my mouth, a couple comes marching down the center of the aisle, and the man starts screaming at me. I didn't even open my mouth. He says, "You have my body here. My mind's going to be a million miles away. I'm not going to listen to a word you have to say." And he rushes back to his seat. So I run after him. I say, "Help me understand what just happened. You know, I didn't say anything." He said, "Look," he says, "my son was diagnosed with leukemia about a year ago." He said, "I'm a physician." He's a physician. He said, "I spent the last year doing what comes most naturally to me. I went and I found the best possible treatments for my son. I traveled around the world to see for this kind of leukemia what's the best treatment." He says, "Now we finally have a weekend that is, for me, a weekend I've been looking forward to for a long time. It's in a beautiful resort hotel. There are counselors for all my children. There are doctors for my sick son. I could finally relax, and my wife is making me go listen to you." And she's in the side whispering to me, "Make him stay, make him stay." So I tell him, "Look," I say, go to your room, it's fine." And he runs away. I never saw anybody get away so fast from me, okay? He runs away. I don't see him the rest of the weekend. His wife sits in the last row, last seat for the whole weekend, shooting murderous glances of rage at me. Okay, not a pleasant experience. Otherwise, the weekend went fine. 6 years later, there's a Friday night program that is for families of children at risk. And it's Friday night, and I was asked to give one of the talks on Friday night. And again, I'm getting up behind the lectern, and the same couple comes marching down the center aisle, and he sees I have post-traumatic stress disorder to this. I'm like ducking behind the lectern, and he says, "Don't worry, I have good news for you." He says, "My son who was sick is cancer-free. The doctors say they think it's a cure. I have to bring him in for a checkup once a year, but he's fine." He said, "But my older daughter, who was always fine, realized it's her turn now. It's safe. So she started to become a real behavior problem. So we decided to come to this weekend retreat. He said, but it's going to be very different than last time, because he said the strangest thing happened over the last 6 years. Based on that weekend 6 years ago, my wife realized, I need to go into my cave. I need to do my problem-solving thing. And she accepted that. And I realized she loves this shrinky stuff. She loves talking about things. She loves talking about emotions. And I respected that. And he said, the strangest thing happened. As I accepted her coping style, she accepted mine, we met halfway, and he sat in the front seat for all the lectures given that weekend. People change, but the key is to deal with alternative coping styles from a position of strength. Next point. The next point has to do with the power of connection. The power of connection. You know, here's one of my favorite studies. They take people and they put them at the bottom of a hill. So they take you as an individual, they put you on the bottom of a mountain. And they say, estimate the steepness of this mountain. Study shows the following. If you're alone, you see the hill is very steep. If you have somebody at your side, the hill looks less steep. The closer you are to the person at your side, the less steep the hill looks and the less tired you get walking up the hill. That's a metaphor for the power of connection reflected in this room and reflected in general in terms of dealing with the stresses in life. Study came out the last couple of years from the field of positive psychology. And it was an interesting thing. They found if you had one question to ask somebody going through a tough time that would predict their resilience the best, just one question. You want to know what that question is? Do you have one person in your life who you could wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning if you were really troubled about something? If the answer is yes, it predicts resilience. When I first read that study, I did something terrible to my poor wife. 3 o'clock that morning, I wake her up and I say, Lonnie, get up, get up. And she says, what, is everything okay? I said, well, is it okay if I talk to you about something? And she says, yeah, sure. I said, fine, go to sleep, okay? So all I needed to know. So if we're blessed with that, it's wonderful. And if we're not, that's fine, that's fine. The question is there a way to recruit, if not that one person, is there a way somehow to figure out if there's some way to foster that sense of connection in some way, okay? And it doesn't only have to come in the form of a 3 o'clock in the morning partner, okay? Final point is cognitive. So far, I didn't talk really about how the way we think about loss can really make a difference. The Baal Shem Tov would say, "B'makam shemachshavto shel adam sham hu nimtza haish." The place where a person's thoughts are, that's where the real essence of the person is. I want to share with you a couple of thoughts about it, but I'm going to keep it short. There's a beautiful thought I heard from Rabbi Hauer in Baltimore at a talk that he gave to one of these retreat weekends to a group of parents whose kids were going through a tough time. And what was amazing about this, I never heard of a talk that more powerfully helped people out, and it was with only one switch of words. It's amazing what parsing out language could do to people's perception of things. And it's going to seem, you're going to almost be disappointed when I tell you what it is. But it's an amazingly powerful way of thinking about our tough times in life. I've used it, and I find it very helpful. He told the parents the following image. He says, I want you to put yourself to the day of Akedas Yitzchak. It's one of the core stories in our national history, and we know that something very famous and well-known, preordained at the beginning of time, at the dawn of time, happened that day. That in place of Isaac being sacrificed, there was an ayil, a ram, sort of walking around innocently that day. This ram, we're told, was created at the dawn of time, and it gets stuck in the thicket so that Abraham is able to take it in place of his son. Whatever that story means, it's a profoundly interesting story and biblical example to look at in a lot of ways. But here's what Rabbi Hauer said. He said, there are two ways of looking at that ram. One is you could look at the ram as being stuck. Right? Isn't that true in life sometimes? We just feel stuck. We feel like a log on the river floating at the mercy of the current. Okay? He says there's another way that we could think of that ram, or that ram, if we could get into its head, could think of itself. You change the word from stuck to positioned. Think about it. That's the key. You could either see yourself as stuck or as positioned. If you're positioned and you see that as your destiny, especially for things you have no control over, it's a game changer. Rabbi Soloveitchik at YU, among others, would talk about in Jewish thought, yiyud versus go-roll, which is basically in life. You could either see the tough times in life as go-roll, as chance. This is the bad luck of life, and I'm a passive agent, helpless in the face of the stresses. Or you could see it as yiyud. This is my destiny, and I'm going to grow from this destiny. And ilu yashavti b'choshech lo haya'ar li. If I didn't sit in darkness, I never would have appreciated light. So that is the cognitive approach in terms of how we view the tough times that happen to us. I'm not saying that you have to accept things. I'm saying it's something a little bit different. You view it as an agent of change. You approach it, as the Talmud tells us, as Amira Davar Ra, if something bad happens to you, you do an internal self-examination and try to find meaning out of it, because all the research shows when we find meaning out of what's happening to us in the tough times in our life, it's a game changer. When you go from passive to active, it's a game changer. There are dozens and dozens of studies that show that. And before I go to my final part here, I just want to share with you the following thought from Rabbi Matisyahu Solomon, and I shared a panel in Brooklyn the day after 9/11. And he said the following thought to people, many of whom were in the thick of things that horrible Tuesday 10 years ago. He said, it says in the Torah that when Jews are in trouble, we're compared to an eagle. Knesher Yair Kino al Gozolav Yirachev. We're compared to an eagle hovering over her young. And he says, why of all the animals in the animal kingdom, why an eagle? He says, because, you know why? He says, because an eagle, unlike any other animal, other animals, if let's say a baby bird is in danger, the mother swoops down, saves the baby, and the baby's in a passive position. The eagle, because she flies higher than any other living thing, she hovers around the nest, and the baby eagle has to hop on her back, taking an active role in its salvation. And that's why the Torah tells us we have to be that way. Knesher Yair Kino. We have to be like that eagle, going from passive to active, from viewing it as go-roll to yiyud, changing it from stuck to positioned. And I think I'll end, instead of with this story. I have so many things I could say about this, but I'll end with a parable. Famous parable that is said over by the Duvna Maggid. And it's again about the tough times in our lives. and how to view it, and going back to what I started with in terms of the sapphire and the brick and the integration of the good and the bad. David has the following story. Story about a king that has a jewel in the middle of his crown that's the biggest diamond in the world. Massive diamond, bigger than the Hope Diamond. And the king is an insecure king. He gets an inordinate amount of feelings of power from having the biggest and the best in the land. One morning, he wakes up. First thing he does, he goes to his nightstand, wants to put the crown on, and he's totally spooked because there's a flaw down the center of the diamond. Not a good omen, he thinks. What does this mean for his future? He's panicked. And he puts out a call to the kingdom that anybody who can fix this flaw, he will make wealthier beyond his wildest dreams. Jewelers come from all over the world to take a crack at the king's diamond, but you can't. You can't fix a flaw in a diamond. A flaw in a diamond is a flaw in a diamond. Except one little old Jew, you have to have a little old Jew as the hero of this story, right, from the Dov Magid. Little old Jew comes into the palace, and he takes the diamond, and he engraves magnificent leaves around the flaw that now become the trunk of the tree that's at the center of the diamond, and it makes the diamond even more beautiful than it was before. Can't get rid of the flaw. Bad stuff happens, and we feel the pain. And we struggle with the meaning of it. And we try to find the new normal, and we try to regain our footing, and we try to support each other. But ultimately, what I find over and over and over again is that even though you can't get rid of the flaw, you could change the flaw into a magnificent tree that makes the meaning and depth of our life even more meaningful and more beautiful. And let me take time for questions. We have either questions. We have either questions or more stories, whatever you're in the mood for. Let's have a vote. Okay. Okay. It's just a little concern. You want me finish in about 10 minutes? Fine. Okay. I'm gonna. What I want to just share with you a story about this theme in terms of reordered priorities, because it's something. If I have to think about one thing I learned most from the various people I worked with who have gone through tough times, it's this sense of reordered priorities and the growth that comes in some ways. And again, nobody would want it. Nobody would ask for it. But let me share with you something I learned from a study I did a number of years ago. I had a grant, together with some colleagues, to look at the impact of having a child with a serious chronic illness. It was a multinational grant, and I designed a whole packet of psychological measures, and we had research assistants fan across the United States to give these measures mostly to mothers of children with life-threatening illness. I was pretty proud of myself. It was pretty early in my career. And almost immediately, I start getting angry phone calls from all the research assistants yelling at me, saying, David, we can't go on with this study. People are furious at us. So I said, why? They said, because everybody's saying the same thing. You didn't ask a single question about what positive came from the experience. I said, well, how could I do that? It seems so arrogant. They said, look, we're just the messenger. You figure out what to do. So I added questions about that. Of course, it became the most valuable part of the study. And here's what one of the women wrote in response to that question. She said, her son was diagnosed with a form of cancer. She said before the diagnosis, the most important thing in her life was to perfect her tennis swing. And when her son was on active treatment, it was a stormy night, and her husband was spending the night in the hospital with her son. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning. She was about to go to the hospital to spell her husband and spend the day with her son. And her doorbell rings. It's her next door neighbor. There was a storm the night before, as I said, and the tree in between their two houses fell on her car and totally destroyed her car, her neighbor's car. Neighbor's inconsolable. She comes into this woman's kitchen, she's crying hysterically, and this mother helps her out. She calls the insurance agent, she gives her a lift to work, and as this woman who lost her car is going into her office, this woman says, I started to laugh to myself because I thought to myself, I would have had the same reaction a year ago. But what if the wind was blowing in the other direction and the tree fell on my car instead? You know what I would have done? I would have said, oh, I guess I better call a taxi. I guess I better get a lift to work. And I would have gone to work because I know what's important in life. I would have gone to the hospital to spell my husband. What's important to my life is to give my husband a break. It's to spend the day with my son. Who cares about things? She says, that's how my life's changed. And I'll end with a somewhat more positive, light note. And with this, I'm truly going to end. I'm within my time, I think. Should be just about right. I shared this story earlier this week with some therapists, and even though it's a baseball story, I South Africanized it a little bit to explain a little bit about the basics of baseball. There's a baseball field in Boston, New York. I heard this story from a trauma expert in Boston. There's a baseball field very famous. It's called Fenway Park. It's where the Boston Red Sox play. It's a legendary field. They usually lose. And there's an off day at the park, and the groundskeeper takes his little 10-year-old son with him to work, and his son is on the field playing, pitching the ball to himself. So right in baseball, if you get 3 strikes, you're out. But he was self-pitching, And the only other person in the park is an 80-year-old man high up in the bleachers in the stands chewing on a cigar. And the boy is at the field enjoying being in this famous place and enjoying being at work with his father. And he calls out to the empty field, I'm the greatest baseball player who ever lived. Picks the ball up, swings and misses, strike 1. He's not daunted. Picks the ball up again. Says, I'm the greatest baseball player who ever lived. Picks the ball up, swings and misses, strike 2. He does it 20 times in a row. You only get 3 strikes. 20 times in a row. Totally not being fazed by the fact that he just missed the ball 20 times in a row, and the old man can't take it anymore. He takes the cigar out of his mouth, and he says, Sonny, stop it. I have to talk to you. And he makes his way down the stands, and he says to the boy, look, I admired your confidence, but let's face it, you have to be realistic in life. You're saying you're the best baseball player who ever lived, and you just missed the ball 20 times in a row. And the boy looked at him proudly, and he says, yes, sir, he says, but have you ever seen such incredible pitching? That's often the challenge. Often the challenge in terms of coping with stress and loss. So you have to figure out the way to focus on the pitching, you have to figure out a way to focus on the tree around the floor, and to transform the lessons of the brick into the light. Thank you.
All English lectures are available online at hidebrut.com.